if you feel comfortable, only if you feel comfortable, you can come a little closer. We can make this a little more intimate. Okay, no takers. All right, so my name is Fennie Wang, and I'm really excited to talk to you guys about open source mobile money and why I'm so excited about the potential for open source mobile transactions, especially when combined with open source identity and what that means for financial inclusion. Okay. So this is the agenda for today's journey. We will start with our definitions, so our point of departure. What do we mean exactly by cash? Is that better? Then we'll go into exploring the different forms of money, looking at wholesale banking money, electronic banking money versus what we mean by digital cash. We'll take a look at local currency. Some of you guys might be familiar with local currency versus formal fiat currency. We'll talk about the rise of mobile money, looking at M-Pesa, for example, in Kenya, and why we need something that's open source. So we'll talk about a really, really cool project that my friend Will Ruddock is doing down in Nairobi with tokenizing and creating a local currency on the POA network. And we'll finish with an interview I recorded with Will last night. So we'll go ahead and get started on what do we mean by cash. So the definitions that I'm going to use as the working definitions in this discussion will be cash is a direct claim on some kind of asset, or if something is not asset-backed, it's some kind of direct promise to something. And so in the context of fiat cash, i.e. government-issued cash, it's a direct claim that you have with the central bank. Right? And this claim is not intermediated by a financial gateway such as a bank or a telecom. So now you might think, well, if I take $1 and I go to the ATM and I insert into the ATM, it goes into my account, I go and use Apple Pay, I go and make a transaction, is that not digital cash? So to make that distinction, once you've put money into your bank account, that no longer becomes cash because it's now money, it's no longer a direct claim that you have on the central bank. You have a claim now against JP Morgan Bank, which then has its claims within the interbank settlement system. So we'll make those distinctions. So the different kinds of, and different shapes of money. So we have two axes here. One is a direct claim, and the other is when you have an intermediary. On the other axis, on the y-axis, we have physical and digital. So if we start in the lower left quadrant, we talk about paper cash. So this is what most people think of colloquially when they think of cash. So we've got physical cash, that's public cash, fiat money. You can also have private cash. So this would be the realm of local currencies. Often the case when either communities can't actually get access to national currencies, so they have to create their own, or they just want to create their own currencies because they want to encourage local flows of production. So that's one example there. The corollary, for example, of a paper cash local currency in digital form would be a cryptocurrency, for example, stable coins like DAI. The corollary of paper fiat cash would be central bank issued digital currency, CBDC. So you might have heard this in different contexts. CBDC is increasingly something that different central banks are exploring because physical cash is rapidly disappearing. So a couple of different rationales depending on where you are in the world. So if you're in a developing country, as I said, you just don't have access to physical cash even. For example, the Central Bank of Bahamas was looking at some kind of CBDC. They have all these little tiny islands, and it's very expensive and difficult to get physical cash out into these small islands because they literally have to fly the cash out on these tiny chartered planes. So you can kind of think of that as the original airdrop. In developed countries, the trend increasingly is that retail shops are going cashless. So it's kind of an incredible reversal of trends from 10 years ago where you go someplace, you're like cash only, and now it's like no cash. So that becomes problematic as well, because if you are unbanked, then you have no way to actually engage in economic transactions. So central banks are looking at this issue. The Central Bank of Sweden, for example, has issued a call looking at various technology tools, including potentially using a distributed ledger technology, or if it doesn't, this is really kind of cute, you can have a direct account with the Central Bank of Sweden, which might work if you're in a small country like Sweden that has less than 10 million people and a very small unbanked population. But obviously, it doesn't scale very well if you have a larger country. And also, you would want ideally your CBDC to mirror the structurally decentralized nature of physical cash, right? So we all have our cash stored in our various different physical wallets, under our mattresses, in the bank vaults. If someone wanted to rob the central bank, you would have to risk life and limb, and there's only so much physical cash you can steal, right? So if you were to replicate that mechanism digitally, ideally you would think you would want to use some kind of technology that mirrors that level of decentralization. So there is work that central banks are looking at in this area. So the Central Bank of England has done quite a bit of research into CBDCs, and they've looked at, on the other side, for example, JP Morgan coin and interbank settlements. So there's a lot of work in the wholesale electronic money markets that are looking at tokenizing various aspects of interbank money. So Singapore has been doing this, Canada, you might have heard about JP Morgan doing this, so that's kind of where they're all playing. But what the Bank of England has said, well, you can try to tokenize that, that's fine, but the social and economic impact of doing this kind of CBDC in the wholesale markets is not nearly as impactful if you can do it for retail money. So that's the money that you and I would use, right? Having that direct link or that direct claim to the central bank. So that's one thing that's really interesting. So if we move to the other side, we talked a little bit already about all the interbank settlement and commercial bank money and how that works. So now we look at mobile money, and this basically is pigging off those legacy banking rails, right? In places like Kenya, where people don't have bank accounts, they were using airtime as a form of money, and so we'll talk a little bit about that as well. Now you've seen probably the news about Facebook having its own payment coin as well. So what we're seeing is that telecoms and internet giants are becoming the new de facto but unregulated banks, although they still rely on the legacy banking rails for that to work. So we'll just talk a little bit about what is a local currency. If anyone here has heard of local currencies before, you could raise your hand. So some of you. You might have been at ETH Denver and used BuffDai, so that would be an example of a temporary local currency. So local currency programs basically function like loyalty programs, except you're loyal to a particular community or trading network. And the idea being is that because this voucher can only be spent amongst these cooperating shops, that economic value stays within that community, and especially if you have negative interest rates or demurrage, it really accelerates the velocity of money greater than national currencies, and therefore stimulates greater local economic production and activity. But these currencies are not usually considered legal tenders, so they're complementary and often softly pegged to the national currency. One thing about local currencies is that they do have trouble scaling because it's inherently based on this very grounded local community trust to barter with each other. And as I mentioned, some examples of local currency include BuffDai at ETH Denver. There's the Brixton Pound, which is in the Bristol Pound. So 2 cities outside of London. They've been doing this since 2012, and maybe they'll want to do this more after Brexit. And then we'll talk about my friend Will's project with Serifree Credit in Kenya, which is super cool. So mobile money 1.0, M-Pesa. And yes, a brief history of colonialism, which is why we need open source mobile money. So the story of M-Pesa, this is really kind of bottom-up innovation that I feel like has been co-opted and made now really unaffordable for people. So in 2002, researchers funded by DFID, which is the UK government international aid organization, so it's the UK equivalent of GIZ in Germany or USAID. So they were doing research in Uganda and Kenya, Botswana. These are all former British colonies. And they discovered that what poor people who were unbanked were doing to send money to their relatives in different villages were that they basically used airtime as a form of money, as kind of like a tokenized money, right? So I can go to a kiosk, send money to a relative on their phone number. They would receive it at a kiosk. They could cash it out, resell it, and that'd be the way to send money around because they didn't have bank accounts, much less any kind of mobile money mechanism. So in 2000, DFID introduced the researchers to Vodafone, which is a British telecom company that owns Safaricom, one of the main telecom operators in Kenya. And they went and did a hackathon. And this poor kid came up with the software, and they gave him like $20, and they took his software, gave it to Huawei and IBM to develop into what is now M-Pesa. And so now you've got M-Pesa being incredibly popular with over 20 million users, but they are not regulated banks, but they serve that banking function. But because they also operate as a monopoly, the transaction fees for M-Pesa have become really inaccessible. And so we'll talk about and explore that in a bit as well. So what's next, in terms of what's next after M-Pesa? And this is a project I'm really excited to share. Grassroots Economics is a nonprofit based in Kenya, started by my good friend Will Ruddick. He's been working on local currencies in Kenya for the past 10 years, so way before Bitcoin and all of that. Sierra Free Credit is a network of 6 different local community currency programs in Kenya. And their constituents are subsistence farmers and traders that are making less than $2 a day. So here's more information about Grassroots. So they've helped over 1,000 small businesses and 20 schools. So you can, through the use of a local currency, you can basically barter your tomatoes for your school fees. And that allows these kids to get to school. They allow flows of money in these communities that couldn't even get access to Kenyan shillings. So what Will has done since end of September of last year is to tokenize or to create a cryptocurrency version of Sierra Free Credit, because before what he was doing was printing physical pieces of local currency, which is very expensive to do. And again, you have to think about the scale of cost. When people are living on $2 a day, printing a piece of paper, it's a significant percentage of your total cost. So. And the other thing about the physical cash, the physical local currencies, it was hard for him to track how that money was exactly circulating. So he started the live pilot with the crypto version of Serafu. It runs on the POA network, and it works on very simple feature phones using a USSD connection into SMS messages. So this is what it looks like. So that's a woman using her phone to send a transaction of Serafu credit. And we have a little block explorer where you can look at all the transactions. So they're tagged by what people are spending their money on. They're tagged by, you can see the wallets. Is it a woman who's been registered to the wallet, et cetera? What kind of business is she running, and so forth. When I was looking through the stats, through the data yesterday, we've got over 1,100 unique wallet users, and I'm really stoked that nearly 60% of the wallets are with women. And as some of you may or may not know, in communities, in these kind of rural communities, women are really the linchpins. So you might have heard about microfinance and how it's that they've discovered that if you loan women money, they will be much more responsible with using that money to run small businesses, and the profits go back to their families. So this is really cool. Of the wallets, about 30% of the women are actively using or conducting transactions. 45% of the men, so 40% total, are using their wallets. We've got over 11,000 trades to date, about 10,000 USD dollars worth of trades. And then you can see what they're spending their local currency on. So this is data that we've never had before, because when you have mobile data, that's mobile transactions that are captive by telecoms like Vodafone, you don't get open source data. You don't know any of this information, and we'll talk about why that's really, really important. So you'll see here, the top 3 buckets of what they're spending money on are food, labor, and health. So we'll compare Seraphu with M-Pesa. So to send a transaction with Seraphu Credit, it's a fixed amount. So 1 USSD connection and 2 SMS is about 2 US cents, so 2 Kenyan shillings. And the POA network fees are currently negligible. You compare that with M-Pesa. So if I were to send about $1 worth of a transaction to someone else in the M-Pesa network, I would be charged 11 cents. So that's a pretty significant transaction fee, right? That's, so the average revenues that M-Pesa makes is about 15 cents per transaction, although that might include some cash withdrawals. But you can see that the difference is pretty significant if you are someone living on $2 a day. And again, as we mentioned, Seraphu is based on open source. So it doesn't require a national currency to back it, whereas M-Pesa still runs ultimately on legacy banking rails. And because that data is completely locked up, and because M-Pesa they're effectively now your gatekeepers on your identity. And this is important for all that data to be open and free. If you are someone living on $2 a day, you don't have a government ID. You don't have anything except for your phone. And if you don't exist, you don't have rights, and you certainly can't get a loan underwritten because there's no information about you. So if we can take the data from mobile transactions, now suddenly there's all this rich information about someone where it serves as an identity attestation that allows a microfinance institution to come in and say, okay, I see you're actively trading in this community. People can make attestations about who you are. We see there's a digital history. Now I can have something by which to underwrite you a loan or an insurance program or something else. So this is where I get really excited about the next wave of financial inclusion and why I think it's so transformative. So the principles of self-sovereign identity, the way that I imagine is you think of identity as digital history. Like, do we have history about someone? And it's through a web of trust. So instead of thinking of identity as being reduced to a single identifier, such as a biometric or some kind of other data string, we think of identity as this web of identity claims or attestations by trust anchors. So as someone from Kiva described to me, think of it as like a Christmas tree. The more you start to decorate that tree, the richer and more beautiful that tree becomes, right? So Kiva, if anyone has heard of Kiva in here? I'm surprised. So Kiva is a really well-known and well-respected microfinance organization. They were one of the first to use kind of tech to pioneer with crowdfunding to get people to put in donations, and then they would then send out the money to various MFIs in their networks. So they're getting into the blockchain identity business because from their perspective, identity is a key linchpin to be able to funnel more institutional capital to the unbanked. So there's only so much they can do in terms of crowdfunding donation money from the retail public and funneling them through a network of small MFIs. If you can have ways to do identity ground up for bottom of the pyramid, that's their belief in how real capital will flow to the unbanked. So they've signed an MOU with the government of Sierra Leone to be their self-sovereign identity provider and build that system for them. And so in Kiva's model, what they will do is issue a decentralized identifier for each citizen, and the first attestation will be made by the government of Sierra Leone. So this will include name, age, date of birth, place of birth, maybe there'll be a biometrics like fingerprints attached to it. The Central Bank of Sierra Leone will require all MFIs, all the microfinance institutions, by law, if they want to receive their licensing from the central bank, to be identity providers to make attestations in the system, right? So one of the major problems, and I worked in Uganda for 5 months, is that you don't have like a national credit bureau. So as an MFI, you're like, well, I can lend this person a certain amount of money, but I don't know what other liens or debts this person might have. So in this case, it can help solve that problem if the MFIs come in and they kind of help bootstrap also the identity system. The private keys associated with the DI, well, because the key pair for signing your identity claims will be held in custody by a trusted entity. It could be Kiva, but it doesn't have to be Kiva, but they will be one of the key custodians. So that's an example of how there's already things in the field being done with identity with someone with such a deep background in microfinance and how closely related identity and financial, and being financially included is. So if we add transaction data in there, so grassroots economics would be, for example, another attester, right? And their attestation will be backed by all the transaction data from transactions in Seraphy Credit. You can also have MFIs make attestations based on loan repayment and so forth. So you start to really grow that rich, you start to really decorate that tree of identity. Okay, so ways forward, what can we do? The first point is around how do we open up our dialogue and our narrative in a way that's politically relevant? So there's a lot of discussion around crypto and blockchain and decentralization, but most people don't really understand what this means, right? So how do we change that narrative in a way that people can care about? So it's not necessarily about crypto, but it's about having cash. It's about having a currency that allows us to freely transact and engage in our right to economically associate without having barriers. And second, to experiment with private cash. I don't think you're going to see CBDC to the retail market for a very, very long time because governments are inherently very risk averse, right? So if we can show more of these experiments on our own, like what Real is doing in Kenya, right? That's hugely powerful in showing there's a new way for us to have this kind of disintermediated access. Although there are always going to be levels of intermediation because the cost of an SMS text is to send Seraphy Credit, right, is determined by Safaricom, which owns M-Pesa, but they still have to be a little more competitive there than they have with transactions on M-Pesa. So there's still different layers to be cognizant around. But with that said, I do want to share with you an interview I recorded with Will last night. We weren't sure how good the Skype connection would be, so to talk about his work in Kenya. So I think you'll really enjoy that.
Hi, Will. I'm really excited that you're here on the line from Nairobi. I'm really excited to, you can't see them, but there are people here, and to introduce you to the EthCC community. What I'm really impressed by the work that you're doing is that you've been out there in the field building this stuff way before blockchain hype came along. You've been out in these communities for the past 10 years, and there's so much blockchain for impact, hype, and bullshit in this space. I think it's really important that people see what it's like for someone to be actually living and breathing and working and building in these communities. So thank you for being here, and I would love for you to introduce yourself and your wonderful, interesting background and your work with grassroots.
Sure, thanks for having me. Started getting into community currencies almost 15 to 20 years ago, and basically I went around the US and a lot of the world, and I looked at how currency systems were being developed in terms of these community local currencies, and most of the technology at the time was just printing little pieces of paper, and that's how I started. So I went from my PhD in physics into econophysics, into economics, and I was really excited about the idea that communities could, create their own tokens or their own currencies back in the day. And the main problem that we were all looking at the time, and this is the people who were before me, was like Bernard Leotar, who passed recently, were basically looking at fractional reserve and looking at interest-bearing debt and saying, well, if we only have one kind of currency in the world, it has huge impacts and problems. And if communities can create their own currencies, if we can actually create a decentralized economy where money is really backed by local production and future capacity and trust, but trust in much smaller units, it would create a much more stable world, and could end poverty and all this stuff. And that was the talk back in the day, in the 90s and the 80s even, and in the early 2000s, and yet really there was almost no one really doing this work where it was mostly stuff being done in like the Brixton Pound in London or Berkshires, Massachusetts, and there isn't a chronic lack of cash there. And in Kenya, I started printing these, the first one back in 2010, and this 20 shilling note with the number 20 on it was trading hands twice a day, and that was in a year. One piece of paper was 100 meals that weren't there before, and I was the fact that worked at all to me was just a message to say, how screwed up are we as humans? If people are not eating, they're not going to school because they're missing pieces of paper. It seemed ridiculous. And architects should not run out of inches, right? Humans shouldn't run out of money if it's a measurement tool, right? And so that was the fundamental idea there. And it was tumultuous when I first started. They thought I was a secessionist terrorist. I had to go to jail, and was eventually cleared by the Attorney General here in Kenya, and we've kind of just started spreading from there. And it wasn't until last year that I really got into blockchain, because of Bancor Protocol enabled it so that we could create tokens that were not connected to Ethereum volatility anymore. We're actually using a side chain that is connected to Ethereum, but the token prices themselves, they can be connected to each other, but not the greater network of speculative currencies. And so now we're in a situation where we can create and airdrop tokens into economies to fill this missing Kenyan shilling gap, connect those community currencies together into a real decentralized economy. So that's what's super exciting right now and where we are today.
Great. Can you give a quick overview of the blockchain aspects of the technical design, including key management and how that works?
Sure. So right now we are somewhat centralized in that we're trying to service, eventually millions of people using feature phones, right? So these are people with no internet and without a smartphone. And so we're acting as a gateway right now for them to the blockchain. So there's an API where we connect to the telecom, and that gives us a USSD menu, which can be on any kind of phone. And so they essentially kind of have a text menu access to their wallet, right? And that is encrypted with a simple PIN that they have in that phone, okay? And so it's important for us, at least at this stage, as a stopgap before people get smartphones. For one reason is the population here, they need to have the ability to do to reset transactions, or to reverse a transaction, or do the opposite, or to reset a PIN that is lost, and it happens all the time. So right now we're sort of filling that gap in a sort of a bit centralized way. But that's, we're using essentially like an AWS server that can be replicated many times over by different groups as well, to control or to host token issuers in different ways, in different areas too. So, one of the things we're really pushing for is that us as grassroots economics in Kenya are not the sole token issuer, right? That there's many organizations and groups down to the level that we have a platform where a municipality or a refugee camp or even a cooperative, a small farmers cooperative, can create their own tokens.
Right. You have to work with particular community groups in order to identify who are the relevant constituents to airdrop and sign them up, right? So can you talk a little bit more about how that works, the human interface of how to make this all work?
Yeah. So, going into a new community, we've got 9 community currencies in Kenya in different areas. And in each case, there's always this sort of like, the door opener is the sort of holder of trust. They're in a way kind of like a backer of last resort. And so we work with schools in this way. We work with farmers cooperatives in this way. And the school basically says, we're going to start accepting these currencies into our school. And that opens up the door to saying, okay, every single parent in that school, we're going to airdrop 400 shillings worth, like 400 tokens, into that, into each individual's wallet. That's going to go into the school for school fees. It's going to go out to teacher salaries. The teachers are going to spend it at the local charcoal distributor or the local, water kiosk, or to get a haircut or some chapatis. Some of those are going to be parents, and it's going to cycle back into the school. So usually we start with some kind of central node, and then we just keep, we do it, it's a process we call braiding, right? So that's a braided loop of economic activity. And then we take that braided loop of people trading with each other, and we just keep expanding that to another loop, another loop. And we're actually in that community and back out of that community within about 3 months. And, we have a really small staff of about 5 people. And so we go in and do some training with the community, and then they're doing that braiding process themselves. And we have a lot of kind of push-pull incentive systems where, we tell people, look, part of the system built in is that if you don't trade every single week, you actually lose 1% of your account. And that goes directly into a community fund that is then redistributed as a basic income to the people who are trading, right? So if you want to save your money, we tell you, don't save it with this, save it right now with Kenyan shillings, but that could be another token, a savings-based token, or investment tokens, or an asset-based tokens, versus what this is very much a medium of exchange. You should be sending your kid to school, eating daily with it, paying your landlord with it if that's what you have to do, and we tie that into all sorts of development programs too, like tree planting, healthcare services, education, and so on.
How do you envision local currencies to scale? Because there's an inherent constraint to scaling of community currencies, because the whole what makes them work is that it's essentially based on I know these people in my community, right? It's an identity reputation system talk in blockchain, right? So if it gets too big, I don't know, right? Like how do I trust that I can trade my vegetables for that person's school fees and so forth? So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think in the past, we still have this idea that, that currencies should get big, and what we're trying to do in Kenya is kind of the opposite of that. Is like, what is, there was this economist, Jane Jacobs, and she would always say, what is the salient unit of the economy for which a currency is appropriate? And exactly what you said there, our currencies in Kenya are basically the size of who you do know, right? And so we're not suggesting that a currency get much bigger than, let's say, at least in these villages of 200 businesses in a currency network. That's a wonderful size of a network. Everyone in that network can basically know each other, right? and they can connect to another currency that's another 200 businesses, 5 minutes away, right? That's perfectly, an appropriate scale for these systems in Kenya. And it works well in terms of identity as well, because each one of those people in your network is a verifier for your own personal identity, right? And so this can work in this identity space as sort of a self-verification system, right? And the trust that's put into that system is based on the productive capacity of that system itself, right? So you've got this economic layer, you've got an identity layer that's meshed into that, and then there's other layers that we can build on top of that, like voting systems is something we're really trying to get some help coding this year.
Great. So jumping on that, how can the community help in what you're doing?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's so much that needs to be done. I mean, I'm pretty much, always, my biggest wish list is that we had more developers that were in the currency space, not the crypto space. And to me, the currency space is much more about looking at this as a platform for which, there's token creation. This is what, the Bancor team is very much focused on, in terms of user-generated tokens. But then how do you connect all that into marketplaces? How do you connect it into point of sales devices? How do you connect it into taxation systems or localizations? If we want to take a similar system and move it into Bogota, Colombia, how is that going to look? And, there's so, I kind of see it as like a, in a way, like Android has created this Play Store that anyone can kind of create add-ons onto various platforms. And so I'm hoping to see that sort of, more and more of that kind of development where we can plug in an identity system, into these networks, that the users could actually have those options and saying, oh, I want to have a plugin that gives some of this taxation to local government, for instance, voluntarily, for instance, Kenya, we're talking about the informal sector. It's, no one pays taxes. It's, less than maybe 30% of the population is really paying any tax. So anyways, there's lots of potential add-ons for different constituencies and different users, and that set of add-ons and analysis tools, like really we're talking about building and load balancing decentralized economies now, real practical economies with fruits and vegetables and stuff, And so if you look at all the tokens right now in the Ethereum space, well, if those tokens actually were representing, different supply chains of vegetables and fruits and education and labor, and we want to actually create systems that evenly distribute that in some fair, systems across, people, it's a whole nother way of thinking about the space. And I really want to push as much as people can into the space, because we've got, billions of people living at less than $2 a day. They need money. And here's all this people in the crypto space that are talking about currencies. So to me, there's a big disconnect. It's like, you guys are talking about currencies. All these people need currencies. What are you doing? So I really would just want to push people into that space, and also, get people to experiment and, kind of look at what we've done in Kenya. I mean, yeah, we ended up going to jail for it, but, I feel like that era is really changing. And as we've moved into blockchain, now, the governments here are very open to the idea, the legal system around what we're doing, because we're not tied into speculation, right? We're essentially doing barter trade, right? It's a whole nother regulatory environment. Forget all these issues of, having to get into, securities and all this stuff. We're trading tomatoes for school fees. If you as a legislator, are listening to this and saying, we need to outlaw that, well, that's not right, right? Exactly. I mean, like, wow, exactly. So if what we're doing is really enabling people to trade their tomatoes for school fees, like it's a whole nother space. And people ask me this all the time, like, oh, is it a security? And I'm like, you're really asking the wrong question. The question is she eating 3 meals a day? Is this helping? Like, And if these tokens, the way we're putting them together in this space are ultimately stable relative to each other, I mean, there's all these other different questions, that we need to start asking as a community focused on solving this problem of poverty, solving the problem of, that entrenched fiat currencies that are, backed by essentially nothing, and that we have private banks overissuing supply constantly.
Well, thank you that is the perfect ending, Will, to this discussion, to this conference, and it's a call to action. So thanks for all the work down there. And I'm gonna visit you soon. All right. Take care.
Well, all right, bye.
Does I have any questions?
Hi. Hi. Thanks for the talk. It was very interesting. First of all, just you might be interested, there's a local currency just outside Paris in Montreuil. It's called, there's a local currency just outside Paris in the city called Montreuil, which is like 20 minutes a bike from here. It's called the Peach, just so people might be interested. It exists, even like they're thinking of expanding it to Paris. So that exists locally. I had a question about the privacy of the block explorer of the Sarafu network. It looked like there was a lot of data that could be in some way tied back to people. Like there wasn't directly people's names or identifiers, but if they're small networks and you can tell, like, the gender of the person, what they're buying and stuff like that, you might be able to start identifying people, and that raises issues, I find. On top of that, because there's another layer to that, is that there's often in colonial thinking this idea that the poor are not going to spend their money right. And so if you start putting aid or anything like that into it, and people can look at what people are spending, they might say, oh, well, see, we're not going to give them the money because they're not spending it right. Spending it right meaning how we would want them to spend it, of course.
Right. So on the one hand, you have to be identified in order to participate in this, because they have to be part of these local, right, it's part of that trust. You're going to issue a wallet or a local currency, you're going to airdrop to these folks because they are part of this community. And therefore, it's kind of like they have to already stake their identity in some ways to the system, right? So can you anonymize some of it, right, for purposes of other data analysis? Perhaps so. But I'm concerned about the privacy part on that. What's kind of interesting about poor spending their money that reminds me, with refugee situations, there's a whole push towards what's called cash aid. Instead of giving people bags of rice, which is really a terrible idea, there's no sense of dignity in how you can live and eat. And it also really hurts the local host economies that host the refugees. So there's been a push towards using cash aid. So you have organizations like Red Cross, Mercy Corps issuing prepaid payment cards to refugees. And so there was that discussion there with just giving poor aid, cash aid, is that one, it is cheaper to administer than flying around bags of rice, but it's also the sense of dignity that it's not our place to tell people how they should be spending what they need, right? If they're gonna go and spend, like in my previous role, like, there were discussions around that. Do you block certain merchant codes, like if they go to some tobacco shop? But it's like, well, you give them $200 a month to buy, if they go and spend it on something that you don't want them to spend it on, well, they spent that money, so they're not going to get it back, right? So you take the overall benefits against the costs, but what's actually really interesting about cash aid is that guys like UNHCR and the World Food Program are very much interested in deploying crypto-based local currencies for refugee camps, because prepaid also has a lot of problems in terms of KYC AML. So suddenly you're an aid organization where your job is to make sure, are you someone in need, to now are you to playing the role of a bank to doing KYC AML. Like, are you who you say you are, and are you someone that I should be my constituent that I'm serving? So there could be lots of innovation and deployment of local currencies within these refugee camps. There are refugee camps in Kenya that have been there since the 90s, right? So these are villages with 60,000 people. So if you want a local currency to scale, that would be the way to do it. If you ever seen in Jordan, they've got a Syrian refugee camp. It's like a village with streets and shops, right? You could deploy your local currency there, right? So there's a lot of possibilities for ways to experiment with this technology.
Any other questions?
Hey, so I was wondering what type of budget went into making all of this happen? This beautiful grassroots economics project?
Like 100K or less. Like all their operational costs as well. So not,
How long
just like the technical stuff, or
how long has this been running, and how much did it cost to set it up?
So the program in general, or just the crypto part?
Like what we just saw here,
Oh, so that's
Yeah.
been since end of September. So you can go on to the the Block Explorer, Will didn't want to share widely because if there's more than 3 people, it kind of crashes right now. So he needs more help, because he's just doing it himself. So it's a shoestring budget, yeah. Oh, there's the guy in the purple.
Hi, thank you for your talk. Maybe I'm off topic, just wondering, there's, if you haven't hear about a charity organization called Give Directly. They work in Kenya, and would also these kind of use cases where charities like this and local communities, would that be also interesting?
Yeah, I think so, because you could just start a local currency program in a village. So if you enroll a particular kind of community trust thinker, so it would be like schools in cases that Grassroots has worked with. So you can enroll these different communities networks as ways to provide flows of trade, because they're growing tomatoes in their backyard. They're growing cabbage during the wet seasons. They're growing other cash crops. So they have goods to give, but there's no way for them to have a way to trade and value against those. So I think Give Directly could be something that allows, could also use something like a local currency to catalyze local economic productivity. Yeah.
Hi, great talk. This is very interesting. You mentioned that you were able. I'm right here.
Oh, there you are.
You mentioned you were able to roll back certain transactions, or like fix different transactions that happened.
I'm sorry. What kind of transactions?
It sounded like Will had mentioned that there was a way to reset a transaction or to reverse something.
Yeah.
Have you had any disputes or theft or anything around the local currencies where you've had to, I guess, take care of the issue, or is that the reason for that?
I don't think he's mentioned any kind of theft issues. Again, because these are still pretty small communities where people have to know each other and they're all bounded together. So there's sort of that reputational trust. Of course, if things start to scale, right, it becomes a question of how do you, it's kind of like, you go to the bank all the time and say, I need to reset this transaction and so forth. But you also have to think about the constituency that you're working with, right? Because if they make a mistake on a transaction, a legitimate mistake, that could be pretty significant for them, right? If they're living under $2 a day, if they can't reverse that transaction. So it's a lot of it is also kind of the local community trust, case management, setting up certain rules and seeing what works in those particular communities.
Okay, so do you have people within the local community also kind of I guess, governing the system as well, or is it just you guys for the time being?
They work with, they have to partner with particular communities. So they partner with schools, farmers cooperatives, and so forth. So there is a human interface of governance, right? So, and I guess it sounds like in the future we'll want to add more governance layers on chain as well. So that could be very interesting.
Cool. Thank you.
Hey, so I'm curious about the integration with Bancor and kind of so a lot of, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. So a lot of what the local currencies do, at least in America in the past, when you look at like Black Wall Street, it's been super successful. But a lot of kind of the fallbacks and the pitfalls of actually expanding this have been, in-person governance, right? It's that idea that we can't, as a people, tell others, and we broached this subject before, is we can't tell others how to best spend their money, right? It has to be kind of an organic, as this is, right? It has to be an organic kind of movement where we want to use this currency. So I'm curious about the integration with Bancor and how that actually plays a role into this, because it seems kind of weird to me, right? And the fact why it seems weird to me is that the integration with Bancor allows you to kind of go in and out of different currencies. So on the one hand, there's remittance where it's like, this is great, you can, travel across. But the idea of this is local currency, right? It's not that I can go in and out. You shouldn't be able to do that. Otherwise, you're not keeping the money within the local communities. It seems a little...
That's a really great question, yes. So the way to think about this is trading between communities. So if I'm here, so there's 6, or I guess now 9 community currencies in the Serafi credit system, right? So this one particular community here wants to be able to trade also with another community somewhere else, right? Because regionally, if you're in a certain part of Kenya, you might be able to produce a lot of produce, such as tomatoes and lettuce, but in a different part, you might be more producing things like grains, right, or sugarcane and so forth. So it allows those 2 different communities to trade with each other. So it's not necessarily, I want this global remittance game between, different countries, but it's just, we have different goods that we produce in each region, and we want to be able to trade amongst each other more easily, if that makes sense.
I guess my question is more on the larger scale of bad actors, as opposed to, I understand the use case, right? That makes sense. But so if I am a personal banker and I see these local communities kind of trading with each other, if I am in the town, I can pretty much like say, I want to buy all this stuff up and sell it on Bancor and then make money with Bitcoin instead of actually keeping within the local communities. And that's really the antagonistic kind of mentality that I'm talking about. There's a huge conflict there, do you get what I'm saying? Has it been thought of yet, or is that like...
I mean, I know there's a lot of the game theory around, but when you're building something from the ground up, like it's not, like people aren't thinking at that, like that's not like their day-to-day concern, right? Like they're like, I just want to like get school fees paid, like I want to go and like get some food, right? Like I want to save 20 shillings so I can like feed my family, right? So I don't think there's, will it at some point, if it becomes interesting, someone from the outside starts doing that? I think those are things we do need to think about, but it's just like so far from the kind of immediate issues in terms of like, does the USSD connection work? Is it cheap enough? Can we get it under 2 cents, right? Can it be even cheaper, right? If you're doing a 20-cent transaction to buy some tomatoes, 2 cents out of that is still too high, right? So that's like the scope of the very mundane issues rather than the game theoretic issues.
And so how much money is actually flowing within the local communities?
I think they've done about 10,000 USD worth of trades since in the last 4 months.
Okay.
Amongst about, but there's over 1,000 wallets, but 40% have done trades on them. So about, I would say, 400 to 500 people have been participating. Yeah.
Awesome. Cool. Thank you.
So is this kind of like creating a utility token for a local community?
What is a utility token?
So it's a new currency that you're tying to specific goods and services, which you've created out of nothing?
I suppose. I mean, I don't know what the right semantics would be, because I think of utility tokens as like shitcoins. I don't know. Like
I didn't say that.
I would like to think that these aren't, because they actually provide real, economic benefits to people.
So how is the supply controlled?
So the supply. Sorry, there's talking. So it's there isn't like a pre kind of fixed supply. No, it's not. So I would say no, it's not a utility token, right? It's looking at what are the needs in the community, how many, and they airdropped a certain amount to each of the participants and the wallets, and they're not kind of a priori controlling the amount of tokens that can be, because the reason why utility tokens do that is because they want the price to rise, right? So there's a pre-fixed supply, and if people use this cool thing, then the price of this utility token goes up and we all get to make money, right? So that's sort of how I'm feeling what a utility token does, and which is very different than what they're trying to do here with a community currency.
So they're controlling the supply ad hoc to try and maybe stabilize the price or stimulate the economy?
Yeah, so they just need lots of demand, right? If you think about it, they just need a lot of demand, that the supply isn't a huge issue at the moment.